We all here? Yeah. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our worst session. I'll ask the clerk to go ahead and call the roll.
Agent.
Here.
Halliburton.
Here.
Haney Keith.
Here.
Nash.
Here.
Willits.
Here.
Whittings.
Here.
All present.
All right, we are all here. Just for some timekeeping stuff, do we have I do not believe we have an executive session. That's what I've heard of. Okay, great. All right, well, thanks, everybody. We've got Mr. Bromwich here with us. I just want to say a couple of things before I pass it over to you. Thanks for being with us tonight, Mr. Bromwich. Tonight for you, I guess, this afternoon still for us. You know, I just want to, before he provides his report to us and to the community, just remind us that this started back this winter, and I see the chief and deputy chief are here. Thank you for being with us. When we were all rocked by the news of a former officer that held racist and white supremacist views and was active in those areas as an officer. And we can only have true community safety when everybody in this community feels safe. When we as a council do is what we've always done, which is invest in safety, but also invest in justice and accountability for everyone. So I want to thank the chief and the department for their quick action, the quick action by this council to make a decision to hire an independent investigator with experience, with no ties to Boise, that could begin to look into this to help provide us with steps forward and anything else we ought to know. So we asked, if you'll remember, Mr. Bromwich to return to council and to the community with a report once he hit the limit that we had set with regard to a contract. And so he is here tonight with us. Thanks for being here. I expect the presentation will be about 45 minutes. And then we've got, based on time, ample time for questions after and a discussion about what we ought to do next. With that, Mr. Bromwich, welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Terrific. Thank you, Mayor, and thanks, members of the council. I see there are a couple of new members of the council. I'm sorry I haven't a chance to meet you in person, but it's a pleasure to meet you virtually. So, Mayor, I'm glad you took us back to how this started. And it started on November 19th when a blogger by the name of Molly Conger, who is a extensive user of Twitter, posted
Mr. Bromwich, I'm going to cut you off. We can hear you, but not as loud as we'd like to be able to hear you. So I'm just going to ask IT to, not on your end. I think we can do it from here. Up the volume some.
I can also speak a little bit more loudly. Nobody's ever accused me of having a soft voice, but yeah, whatever technical help I can get would be great.
Great, thank you.
So this began again on November 19th when this tweeter, this blogger, Molly Conger, who has 150,000 followers, said the following. When the speakers for this weekend's American Renaissance Conference were announced earlier this year, the face of one speaker who was appearing under a pseudonym was obscured. That's because he had not yet actually retired from the Boise Police Department at that time. The entire thread that follows contains discussion of the white supremacist belief that Black people are biologically predisposed to commit violent crime, including screenshots of essays and a video clip, this is Ms. Conger talking, of an interview espousing those views. Daniel Vineyard, a pseudonym borrowed from the younger brother character in American History X, is Matthew Bringleson. He retired from the Boise Police Department in August of this year. She went on, in an interview posted in September but recorded in May, while Bringleson was still employed by the Boise Police Department, he and infamous white nationalist Jared Taylor discussed their shared view that Black people are inherently biologically criminal. She went on, here is Captain Bringleson telling Jared Taylor that, quote, almost without exception, violent crimes are committed by Black people, he says. It's a script. And it happens every single time that Black people resist arrest and make false accusations of racism. In a July 2020 guest essay on the American Renaissance blog, under his Daniel Vineyard pseudonym, Captain Bringleson describes Black people as ignorant, lazy, and violent. Many of the anecdotes in the pseudonymous article are repeated in his on-camera interview 2 years later. So that's what got it started on November 19th. There was a patent lawyer in Minnesota, of all places, who, as a hobby, monitors white supremacist websites. And he saw Ms. Conjur's tweets, and he called in cold to the Boise Police Department and said his name. He said he thought the police department should be given a heads up that a former policeman, Mr. Bringleson, will be speaking at a white supremacist event soon. This gentleman said it's all over Twitter and other websites if we want to look it up. He said he doesn't need a call back, but wanted to let us know what's going on. And I spoke with this gentleman, and his motives were exactly that he cares about racism and white supremacy, and he thought the police department ought to know about it. The call was taken by a records assistant. She took it down diligently. She reported it up the line to the watch commander. Watch commander reported up the line to Captain Jim Quackenbush. And Mr. Quackenbush, Captain Quackenbush, that same day wrote a memo to the city attorney with a copy to Deputy Chief Tammany Brooks, advising them about the situation. So those are the events that started all this. And what Ms. Conjur quoted, believe it or not, was not even the worst of what was published online and what shocked so many people in Boise, including the mayor and the members of the city council and so on. And I will just refer, this is approximately a dozen pages or more that was published in something called the UNZ Review, UNZ, which by Media Bias Fact Check, a well-known and respected organization, is rated as a questionable source due to extreme right-wing bias, promotion of propaganda and hate, and utilizing poor sources. Among the things that Captain Bringleson said was, many Blacks seem not to understand what a metal detector does, and then told a story about a Black woman putting an infant car carrier on the X-ray machine. He went on to say, I was made to understand that my naivete about Black people had nearly got me killed. Almost without exception, when the police cars come into view, Blacks would take off running in different directions. He said, I later learned that Blacks used stove in their homes for heat, so they referred to chilly nights as 4-burner nights. He said, in describing his own training in Southern California, the Chula Vista Police Department, he said, the bronze team was almost all Black, except for a few white obese officers. I remember watching Blacks feign injury or intentionally run into things to hurt themselves and avoid running. Time after time, they would be excused from physical training. Blacks were subpar in report writing and shooting skills as well. Time after time, my classmates and I noticed obvious failures on the shooting range. It was at this moment, he says later on, that I became aware of the violent tendencies of Blacks. It goes on and on and on. And I think that's what so alarmed the mayor and the members of the city council and made them recognize that something needed to be done. So the mayor actually tweeted something, as did Councilwoman Wooding, the following day on November 20th. And the day after that, clearly feeling alarm and the need to do something about it. I was contacted by the mayor through a mutual acquaintance. I'd never met the mayor before. I'd never spoken to her before. And in fact, forgive me, I did not know who she was when she called. She said she understood that I had expertise in law enforcement oversight, which was true, and wondered whether I did the kind of thing that she felt the city needed to be done, which is a comprehensive investigation that started with Captain Bringleson, but didn't end there, whose aim would be to try to determine whether he infected the police department with his racist and white supremacist views, or whether there was a broader culture of racism or white supremacy in the Boise Police Department. That was our initial discussion. Over the next week or so, from about November 22nd to 29th, I had further discussions with the mayor, with the city attorney, and we talked through what seemed to be needed to allow the city to get to the bottom of this. And just as a background note, I know there's been some criticism of the city going outside of Boise to find a group and a person who has experience doing this. And I will just say on my own behalf, I have 29 years of doing law enforcement oversight, first at the federal level when I was the Inspector General for the Department of Justice, when I oversaw the FBI, the DEA, the Marshal Service, the Bureau of Prisons, and so forth. And over the last 20 years, I have been heavily involved in work with local police departments, first as an independent monitor of the DC Police Department, pursuant to a Justice Department investigation, then did an extensive investigation of the Houston Police Department Crime Lab, have worked with the city of Chicago, have worked with the city of Washington, D.C., and most recently had done one of the most extensive investigations of corruption in a police department that had ever been done, an investigation of the Baltimore Police Department and a scandal that they faced several years ago. So we had these discussions and we agreed on a scope of the investigation, which I believe is a public document, and the scope was quite broad. It talked about our investigating, quote, whether retired BPD Captain Matthews Bringelson's stated racist beliefs infected his policing during his employment, his interactions with the community while acting as a representative of BPD, his former roles and responsibility in BPD, and whether it was transmitted to or imposed on those he supervised, and whether city resources were utilized in the manufacture of racist materials or content. The investigation will also seek to determine whether racist ideology runs deeper in BPD. Specifically, if BPD members who hold racist or white supremacist views have allowed those views to, number one, taint their policing, number two, influence BPD's hiring and promotional practices, policies, and procedures, three, improperly affect BPD's internal investigations and community-based complaint process, and or play a role in use of force during citizen encounters, charging determinations, training, and community engagement. The scope of work goes on, but it was framed quite broadly because none of us, not the mayor, not the members of the city council, not the city attorney, and certainly not me, knew what the scope of the problem was and whether it was limited to one rogue, deplorable officer or whether it was a broader infection within the Boise Police Department. So once we had signed the contract, we understood that this was a matter of great urgency to the city. We immediately came out to Boise. We had meetings, really not interviews, but just get to know you and tell us what you think we need to know meetings with the mayor and her chief of staff, with council members, with the city attorney and other in-house counsel. And then we branched out and talked to a number of other stakeholders who have continuing contact with the Boise Police Department. We talked to representatives of some interest groups, including the Women and Children's Alliance, the Idaho Black History Museum, and so on. In addition to those individuals, we met with the Ada County prosecutor, Jan Bennett, the Ada County Public Defender, Anthony Geddes, and his representatives, and others. And because we had heard already that through conversations that we'd had with both Chief Weininger and Deputy Chief Brooks, that there was some hostility to the idea of an external investigation. People thought that some city officials had painted with too broad a brush and impugned the integrity of members of the police department broadly. And so they suggested that we talk to the then serving head of the union, Kyle Wills, which we did. And Mr. Wills confirmed that there were some negative thoughts about an outsider being brought in to do an investigation of this kind. And we asked him, we had a very productive exchange with him about what we could do to settle people down, make them realize that this was not a witch hunt of any kind, but instead gather relevant facts, draw relevant conclusions, and make recommendations to the city. So that was our first trip, and that was the week of December 12th to 15th. And the overall purpose was simply to get a lay of the land, to meet some of the key people who were involved in dealing with the Boise Police Department. And then we had extensive interviews with Chief Weininger and Deputy Chief Brooks. And as you all know, Chief Weiniger is a long-term, very experienced, widely admired member of the Boise Police Department for decades, and was able to fill us in on a lot of the history of the department, the different chiefs who have headed the department, the way the culture was in the department under those chiefs, and so on. Deputy Chief Brooks had a very different perspective. Obviously, he was quite new. He'd been brought in just within the last couple of years, and had an outsider's but very informed perspective because of the previous work he'd done in a California police department. Let me tell you a little bit about the protocols we followed in doing interviews, beginning with the interviews of Chief Weiniger and Deputy Chief Brooks. First of all, and I know there's been a lot of controversy about the costs involved, I do want to say, and I'm happy to take questions later on about this, we were very careful from day one to try to keep costs as far down as we possibly could. To give you an example, the rate that we charged, which was a blended rate for all lawyers, is less than half of what I normally charge clients on an hourly basis, less than half. And the way that law firms run up bills is frequently to have 3, 4, 5, 6 lawyers attend interviews. I represent a number of clients in the special counsel investigations currently being done in Washington, D.C. The government brings anywhere between 4 and 7 people to those interviews. In the interviews that we did, we had one other person there for the most part. For the first trip, we had 3 people, but for all of the other interviews, we had 2. We had a senior lawyer and we had a junior lawyer who was there to take detailed notes and prepare a memorandum to share with the team so that they knew what we'd learned from a particular interview. With respect to those interviews, we told people that the interviews were on the record. That is, that we were able to use any of the statements made, either quoting people or paraphrasing people. But if they needed to talk about something that was particularly sensitive or confidential, they could go off the record and tell us, look, I want to tell you this, but I don't want it attributed to me. So those were the ground rules really from the beginning. The other ground rule that didn't sit well right away was that we do not allow union representatives into interviews, because the union steward or the representative of the union doesn't owe an individual allegiance to the individual union member with whom he's sitting. The union steward represents the union as a whole, and therefore it's really his or her responsibility to share what witness 1 says with witness 2. That is not, in my judgment, and I've had this view for over 20 years, that is not the way to preserve the integrity of an investigation. And so we always allow individual counsel to accompany members of the police department or any other individual witnesses we interview. We do not allow union representatives to participate. That initially ruffled some feathers. We were able, as we were with many other issues that arose, to deal with those. And ultimately, we were able to interview all the members of the department with a small number of exceptions who we sought to interview. So what kind of significant information did we originally gather from the interviews of Chief Weiniger and Deputy Chief Brooks? Well, we learned about the history of the BPD through principally the eyes of Chief Weiniger. We learned preliminary information about Mac Bringleson and the race-related issues within BPD. We learned about who was on the command staff, where they'd come from, what their particular jobs were, and so forth. And we dipped our toe into the issue of how promotions are handled within the Boise Police Department, and we'll return to that subject in a few minutes. We also, as a result of conversations with members of the City Council and others, almost immediately created a website for our investigation, which included a tip portal by which we encouraged people to bring issues that were within the scope of our investigation to our attention so we could pursue them. And we did get some tips, not that many, not as many as I had hoped, but we did get some, and we followed up on them and followed through on them almost immediately. Now, the 2 building blocks of an investigation like ours are interviews on the one hand and documents on the other. And as quickly as we could, on December 12th, we provided a lengthy 7-page document request to the city attorney which called for a whole variety of things, obviously centered initially on Matt Bringleson, his personnel file, his internal affairs file, his emails, but also a broad set of documents that related to relevant policies, training administered within the police department, any documents related to how supervision works within the police department, and also how the accountability system works within the department. Now, that document request placed very substantial demands on the Boise Police Department, and we heard back about a month after the initial request was provided that some of the documents they were unable to provide, either because the documents were too old or the systems they had were incapable of producing them. And admittedly, some of the requests were fairly broad. And so through very productive and constructive discussions with members of the police department, particularly administrative personnel in the police department, we narrowed those requests and tried to make them more manageable. And because we were eager, just for selfish reasons, to get our hands on the documents because they are so significant. So on January 31st, there was a substantial production of documents that was made in response to our document requests. And we received a total of 105,000 documents. That's not pages. That's 105,000 documents. And given the form in which they were delivered, it's actually quite taxing to figure out how many pages, but 105,000 documents is a lot. 82,000 of those were related to Captain Bringleson's communications. And they also included his very extensive internal affairs file. He'd had a large number of complaints filed against him during his 24-year career in the police department. The week of January 9th, we returned to Boise and we did a second round of interviews. We interviewed all the captain level personnel in the department, many of whom, as you know, came from outside Boise. Captain Nia, Captain Quackenbush, Captain Fomby, who we actually had interviewed a little bit before that because we had found out through the good graces of Deputy Chief Brooks that Captain Fomby was about to leave, and he thought it was significant for us to try to get a hold of him in order to get his perspective on the department. And we also interviewed the captains who were homegrown, Captain Ruffalo and Captain Jones. We also interviewed close associates of Bringleson's who were within the department and who we had been told he had close relationships with. The other two people that we interviewed were Mike Masterson, the former chief, who we interviewed for 2.5 hours, and Ryan Lee, the most recently departed chief, who we interviewed for 4. As I'm sure you know, Mr. Masterson had written an op-ed in the Idaho Statesman questioning our selection and whether it was a waste of money to hire us. And I thought it was a good idea to find out what his views were and to give him the time and space to tell us what he thought was important about the Boise Police Department and what his tenure had been like, first from 2005 to 2015, and then as the interim chief of police, I believe in 2019. And Mr. Masterson said at the end of the interview that he, based on the interview and our knowledge of the field and our professionalism, that he was going to recommend to everyone that he knew in the Boise Police Department that they should go ahead and interview with us. And he exchanged several additional emails with me offering his help and his cooperation. The interview with Mr. Lee took about 4 hours. All of you know the circumstances under which he left, but he's a very knowledgeable guy about policing. And he had some very significant and important observations about what the Boise Police Department looked like when he got here, what some of the changes were that he tried to institute while he was here, some of the obstacles that he faced in terms of implementing those changes, and his concern about the circumstances under which he left. Unfortunately, we were not unable to come even close to completing the interview with Chief Lee. We were going to do that at a future time, but because of cost considerations, we were not able to do that. And then subsequently, after our visit, the former Chief Bill Bones was out of the country at the time, but we were able to interview him by Zoom again for a period of 2.5 hours or so, and got his perspective on his career in the department, his tenure as chief, his observations about the department from afar after he'd left, and so on. From about February 1st through March 6th, of 2023. We took it as an important objective to, as quickly as possible, talk to as many minority members of the police department as we possibly could. Because if there is racism and white supremacy in the department, you would have thought that they would be very tuned into that. And so what we did is we developed a series of questions for those minority members of the department, African American, Hispanic, American Samoan, and others, to test whether their experience was of racism in the department or not. And I'll just go quickly through some of the questions we asked them because I assume you'd be interested in that. How were you recruited? Did you feel welcome when you joined BPD? Do you recall approximately how many other members of minority groups were in BPD at the time that you joined? Did you have the impression that BPD was making efforts to diversify its workforce at the time you were recruited and since you were hired? Did you feel fully accepted as a colleague by the leadership and the rank and file within BPD? Did you ever experience discrimination or racism of any kind from the leadership and or rank and file of BPD? Did you ever see any evidence of discrimination or racism towards any of your BPD colleagues? Are you aware of any complaints of racism or discrimination filed by any member of BPD? If so, is it your understanding that the complaint was taken seriously and investigated thoroughly? Do you think you had an equal chance at promotions or the most valued assignments? Did you ever seek promotions within BPD? Were you ever the subject of racial comments or racial epithets from citizens you dealt with while on the job? What were your experiences dealing with Matthew Bringleson? And for current employees only, because we interviewed both current and former employees, what is your assessment of how BPD has dealt internally with the highly publicized racist and white supremacist statements made by Bringleson? So we interviewed 18 current and former minority members of the department. And I think we got a lot of valuable information from them. In general, not to skip ahead, most of the minority members that we interviewed said that they had not experienced discrimination in the department, that they had not seen evidence of racism or a white supremacist ideology in the department. They had experienced racism at the hands of residents of Boise numerous times, including use of the N-word on multiple occasions by multiple civilians to African-American officers. And one of them had an amazing and wonderful retort, which was, I've been called that all my life. Certainly you can do better than that. And that shut up the person who was calling him the N-word. What we had done is to keep track of our costs. We had hoped and believed that the funding that we originally accorded would be augmented later on, but we were very mindful of the limit. And as we approached that limit, we notified the mayor and her chief of staff that we were approaching the limit. And even though we had planned a third trip to Boise for the week of March 6th, we canceled that trip because we did not want to incur additional costs beyond what we'd already incurred and the work that we needed to finish up, for example, the drafting of interview memos and so on. We then had periodic discussions with the mayor, various council members, for periods in March and April. And then at the end of those series of calls on April 21st, Mayor McClain advised me of her decision not to authorize further work on the investigation. So that's sort of a summary of what we did and how we went about our work. I'm now prepared to share with you our provisional findings, and I want people to fully understand that this is without having reviewed any of the documents, the 105,000 documents that we obtained. And so I think, as one of the council members said, these conclusions are delivered with not a high level of confidence because no investigation is complete without reviewing the relevant documents. Nevertheless, our provisional findings are as follows. First, people that we interviewed, members of the department, were generally surprised to learn of Matt Bringleson's views as expressed in that awful posting and that awful interview, which largely echoed the posting. That included at least one BPD member who was viewed as his closest friend in the department, who was African American. But the publicity given to Bringelson's comment did raise suspicions among many, especially minority members, that there were other people like Bringelson lurking inside BPD who simply hadn't been public with their views. Many of them said they had not suspected that anybody had those views. But once Bringelson's views were publicized, it made them wonder, what kind of a working environment am I actually in? If this guy who I knew at a minimum, as hi, how you doing in the halls, was capable of holding those kinds of views. Even Bringelson's close associates claim that they saw no evidence of racism or his white supremacist views. The majority of the minority members of the department, that is the majority of people who are African American or Hispanic, Asian American, or belong to some other minority group, said that they have not experienced racism or discrimination in the workplace. But a small but significant number say they have experienced it, and they provided details of what they experienced. We're aware of 2 members of the department no longer with the department, including one who was one of the very first African-American members of the department, who did apparently experience racism. But in one case, we were not able to chase him down. And in another case, we were able to chase him down, but we stopped our work before we were able to talk to them. Next, there were a large number of internal affairs complaints about Bringelson. 11 of them were sustained.
Sorry. Oh, me, yes.
That was very loud. I apologize.
Excuse me.
I just wanted to see if I could get maybe a better definition of a small but significant amount of officers. Because in one sense, we're hearing that a majority of the officers hadn't felt racism within the department, but then in another statement, a small but significant minority. And I'm just wondering if you can kind of frame that a little bit better for me.
Yeah, what I mean by small is a half dozen or so said that they had experienced. And I want to be clear, we interviewed not only people who were officers, sworn officers, we also interviewed other employees of the police department, because it's obviously as significant if they've experienced racism within the department than if officers have experienced racism. And so there were a relatively small number, a half dozen or so, but enough to be of concern. And a couple of episodes, there was a real concern that they were not taken seriously and the complaints were not followed up on. So as I said, I don't know if you heard this, but Bringelson had an extensive internal affairs file. 11 of them had been sustained over time. Again, we didn't dig into the bowels of the internal affairs complaints, because again, that would have taken hours and hours of work. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at internal affairs files. They're often difficult to decipher. We spent hundreds of hours deciphering IA complaints in our investigation in Baltimore. It takes a very, very long time. Another conclusion was that Matt Bringelson was an extremely poor supervisor. He was frequently absent, and there were many negative views of him. He was characterized as lazy, as unavailable, and liked but not respected by his peers. And in connection with the promotional process, a survey instrument called SurveyMonkey that I'm sure some of you are familiar with were and I believe still are used when someone or someones are eligible for promotion. And we obtained the SurveyMonkeys for Matt Bringelson for 2009 when he was eligible for promotion to sergeant, and then again in 2019 when he was eligible for and was promoted to lieutenant. So I want to emphasize at the outset that many people treat this exercise as perfunctory, and what you normally find is a lot of positive things said about people. And there are a number of positive things said about Bringelson in these SurveyMonkey responses. But the negative ones are concerning, and alarming. And I will read you a sampling, but only a sampling of them. The only thing said about Matt by most who know him and have worked with him in the last several years is he has never been ashamed of being lazy, lazy, lazy. Nor does he have any problem with telling everyone he is lazy, lazy, lazy. Next comment. My personal interaction with this candidate, along with direct information such as replies to emails and hearing conversations, is very negative. He is lazy, demeaning, and negative. I would be very disappointed to see him as a supervisor or a mentor to subordinates. Next, Matt has issues in dealing with the public. He is often very rude. When Matt was at a particular assignment, he often blew off cases and failed to follow up. Having worked with Matt, I found him to be intelligent and is extremely sociable. However, he does have a tendency to be lazy. Matt has made several comments to his peers to the effect that he wants to be a sergeant so he can make more money and do less work. Nice guy who wants to joke about everything, hard to take seriously. Will his subordinates take him seriously? Matt knows how to say what people want to hear. Great salesman. I don't know that he knows when to turn that off. This candidate needs to show some more maturity before moving into a supervisory role. As a result, it appears to many of us that popularity, connections, and an ability to stay below the radar qualify too many candidates for promotion. From my direct observation of this candidate, he has a very difficult time keeping his personal bias or dislike of officers from influencing decisions. It is common knowledge that he has friends in high places, and this tendency to talk out of school is great cause for concern among many of us, myself included. It is also uncertain at this point exactly what Matt knows and doesn't know about policy, procedure, and patrol functions. He often speaks degradingly about other employees. He shows a side of him that is very negative and that could negatively affect officers under him if that isn't realized and corrected. One senior member of the department at that time who was involved in considering Mr. Bringleson for promotion was strongly opposed to him and said, if this goes through and he becomes a supervisor, we will be reading about this in the newspaper someday. Unfortunately, it was quite prophetic. So that was 2009. Then we skip ahead, and I'm not reading you even a small percentage of all the critical and complimentary comments about Bringleson. So this is 2019, where he's eligible for promotion to lieutenant. It is clear that his officers enjoy working for him for one simple reason, which is that he leaves them alone. While that is a trait many officers look for in a supervisor, Sergeant Bringleson ignores what is going on around him. He constantly talks smack about other officers that don't fit the in crowd. He treats the public poorly, often as he is confrontational with them and often dismissive of them when they approach. That kind of leadership leads to targeting of officers that he does not like. His maturity level needs to rise quite a bit further before he can be considered a commander in this agency. Next comment. I have personally seen concerning behaviors in regards to integrity, ethics, constitutional rights, and accountability. These are critical characteristics for a leader, and they should be held to a high standard in order to have the ability to hold their subordinates to that standard. And there are more. Last one. In my opinion, Matt should have been demoted years ago. I've personally seen him make fun of officers because of their looks, their name, or even the way they talk. He is a loudmouth, bully, and people laugh with him because they fear being on his bad side. He shouldn't be a sergeant, much less a lieutenant. So it seems clear from that and other information we gathered during our interview. So those are contemporaneous comments about him by his peers in 2009 and then again in 2019. And yet he was promoted. So it's clear that Bringleson was singularly ill-equipped for a supervisory role. People were surprised when he was promoted to sergeant. They were more surprised when he was promoted to lieutenant, and they were surprised a third time when he was promoted to captain. And this really does represent a failure of the promotional process within the Boise Police Department, because the overall diagnosis was that he had the right contacts, that he was a member of an internal club, within BPD where members took care of each other. As I think you all know, Bringleson had severe mental health issues resulting in his being institutionalized, including in late 2021. It was well known in the department that even before then, he had a substance abuse problem and he had an alcoholism problem. And yet he remained in the positions that he was. We don't know, frankly, the relationship between his substance abuse and his alcoholism on the one hand, and the sentiments he expressed, the horrific, egregious sentiments he expressed in the video interview and in the article that he published, we just don't know. So let me turn relatively quickly to the aspects of the investigation that unfortunately remain incomplete. We didn't review, as I said, any of the documents and the other evidence, which is a cornerstone of any investigation that should be deemed complete. Did not review the IA files. We did not review the emails. We did not review the enforcement activity records of Bringleson. We did not review any body-worn camera footage, which may well have reflected the way he treated citizens as a supervisor. There are many relevant witnesses that we didn't interview, including numerous minority members of the department. We didn't have any contact with the CCAP members, which I know Chief Weiniger and Deputy Chief Brooks were trying to arrange for us. And on the trip to Boise that we had planned the week of March 6th, we were going to meet with them. We haven't been able to do any meaningful outreach to community groups and communities, the Somali community, the other immigrant communities, to talk to individuals and find out what their experience has been dealing with Boise police officers, and if they have had experiences that reflect that they were treated poorly because of their race or their creed. We also didn't have a chance to do a set of interviews with white officers, finding out what their attitudes were towards race and ethnicity, and whether they think there have been too many efforts, for example, to diversify the department. I'm sure that some people resent that. We didn't have a chance to do that. And we were also unable to concern Chief Lee's concerns, which I know he had brought to people's attention about racial discrimination in hiring. So those are the things that we were unable to complete that we thought and hoped at the beginning that we would be able to complete. So let me conclude with sharing with you some recommendations that we have based on an admittedly incomplete investigation. One is to continue focus on minority recruiting. As the community in Boise changes, the police department has to change. And so a continued focus on minority recruiting is important. The Boise Police Department did not hire its first African-American officer until 1989. That was way too late. And the effort needs to continue to focus on minority hiring. Every police department in the country right now is facing staffing shortages. I know that. I know Boise is facing that as well. One lesson that police departments have learned in the past is do not, under any circumstances, lower your hiring standards, even in the face of staffing shortages. Books can be written about police departments that did that. Police department in Washington, D.C., the Metropolitan Police Department, which I'm very familiar with, lowered its standards in the late 80s and the early 90s because it was suffering because of the crack epidemic and the widespread violent crime in Washington, D.C. They lowered their standards. They lowered the educational requirements. They lowered the amount of work they did in background investigations. And lo and behold, 5, 7, 9 years later, officers engaging in unlawful use of force, in corruption, and so on, at a level not previously seen in the DC Police Department. That is a view that was widely shared by all of the executives in the DC Police Department. Subsequent to that, I've talked to executives in other police departments, and they share that same experience. Third recommendation is ensure that recruit training is rigorous and incorporates adult learning principles. Until recent reforms that were inaugurated by Chief Lee and Captain Fomby, we were informed that no one had failed out of the Boise Police Academy in the last 10 years. That's unacceptable. The average flunk out rate at academies, police departments around the country, tend to be anywhere between 10 and 25%. If you're failing no one, your standards are not high enough. And what we heard from people in the department is that the standards for recruit training were not rigorous, and the buck was handed off to field training officers, which, as you all know, is the stage after officers get out of the academy. And the field training officers had these problem recruits dumped in their laps, and they had the choice of either recommending that they be terminated or passing the problem on to the first supervisor after FTO training. So I think there have been improvements in training under Chief Lee and Captain Fomby, but it's critically important that training continues to be a high priority in the department. Our understanding, we didn't have a chance to examine this in great detail, but from talking to witnesses, I gathered that the training records in the department are not what they should be. It's very important that the police department knows exactly who's been trained when and on what, so that they can figure out who needs to be retrained in certain areas and just what the history is of training members of the police department. Next, there needs to be supervisory and leadership training to create a strong bench for promotions. I'm not aware that there has been such training in the department. Again, that may be because of the incompleteness of our investigation, but we were told by executives, current and former, in the department that applicants for high-level positions in the department, internal candidates, were, among other things, unable to prepare passable resumes to apply for supervisory positions. That's just not acceptable. There needs to be training, leadership training, supervisory training, and the ability to put themselves forward as credible candidates for supervisory positions. Next, in order to continuing to take the temperature of the department, it's vital to conduct detailed exit interviews with absolutely every departing member of the department. That's the moment where they will feel freer to talk constructively, critically, and we hope fairly about the positive dimensions of the department, the negative dimensions of the department, things that are admirable and need to be continued, and those things that need to be changed. To my knowledge, those are not done at all in the department. They need to be done not by administrative personnel in the way that I've seen them done in other cities, because they don't know the right questions to ask, and they can't gain the trust of outgoing police officers in particular. It has to be current officers or it has to be former officers in order to get the kind of benefit that you need from the exit interview process. Next, I think it's important that the department consider reforms to the critical incident task force. We weren't able to dip into this as deeply as I would have liked, but my understanding is that when you have an event like an officer-involved shooting, that the critical incident task force, the way it staffs cases, is that somebody from outside the Boise Police Department, if it's a officer-involved shooting involving a member of the Boise Police Department, it's somebody in a different department that takes the lead in doing the investigation. There is participation by a member or members of the Boise Police Department, but it's not led by somebody in the Boise Police Department. What does that mean? That means if the outside department is like any other department in the country, it puts a lower priority on the business of another department than they put on their own business. And the result is that investigations conducted by that kind of a task force composed in that way means that those investigations take longer than they should and are assigned a priority lower than they should have. And the accompanying problem with having the criminal investigation of, let's say, an officer-involved shooting is that the administrative investigation, that is the investigation to determine whether discipline ought to be imposed on an officer, let's assume there is no possibility of a criminal prosecution, that the administrative investigation should take place promptly so the department can determine whether somebody has violated a policy or multiple policies in their conduct in an officer-involved shooting or another serious use of force and so forth. This is not a problem unique to Boise. It's true all over the country. The Department of Justice has made a high priority in all the cities where they've done pattern or practice investigations to emphasize that it is critically important for administrative investigations to proceed in parallel with any criminal investigations. Because the truth of the matter is that even when, let's say, a critical incident task force investigation is completed, it then moves to the prosecutor's office, and even very diligent prosecutors, frequently because of the complexity of the facts, takes a very long time, 6 months, a year, 18 months. In DC, I've seen cases that took 2 years, 2.5 years, 3 years. It's simply unacceptable that the administrative investigation is either put on the back burner or taken off the stove entirely while a decision on whether to prosecute is pending. And even though criminal prosecutions are rare, they nevertheless, prosecutors look at them carefully and frequently take a long time to decide them. In most cases, pretty much the only part of the investigation that can't be done when a decision on criminal prosecution is pending is an interview of the subject officer or officers, because that would be a compelled interview, and that has the potential to interfere with the criminal prosecution. But most of an administrative investigation can be investigated at the same time as the criminal investigation is being conducted and is pending in the district attorney's office. And to my knowledge, that is not done in the Boise Police Department. And again, you're not alone in that, but it's an area where police departments again and again and again miss on the opportunity to administrative meaningful discipline because the internal justice is neither swift nor certain. It takes sometimes a year, sometimes 2 years, sometimes more for the police department to circle back and actually take care of the administrative part of the process. Next, you need to ensure that your body-worn camera policy includes the requirement to record sound and not just video. Now, I believe Chief Lee changed that by executive order, but members of the department that we talked to confirmed that at least at times following the introduction of body-worn cameras, that a standard practice was to turn the audio off. Well, it's the interaction and exchanges with residents and citizens that are so important. And yet, as a matter of practice and maybe a matter of written policy, I don't know, sound was not being recorded, which really undermines one of the central purposes of body-worn cameras, which is to record all aspects of problematic encounters between police officers and residents. Next, and I'm almost done, two more. There needs to be a rigorous process for approving outside consulting and speaking commitments. The most obvious example is Bringleson, but there are other members of the department, current and former, who have had extensive speaking engagements and consulting gigs. And one problem is the amount of time they spend, and another problem is the potential diffusion of their focus on their job. Their main job must be to serve the people of Boise. And if that at any time becomes subordinated to pursuing their own career as consultants or public speakers, that's to the detriment of the department. Last but not least, it's important that the executives in the police department fight the natural instinct to be insular. It's really important to take stock of what other major police departments are doing around the country, to explore opportunities to learn from other police departments through a variety of arrangements, or to bring in outsiders to review what's being done in the department. Insularity is a big risk. I remember many years ago, I did an investigation of the FBI lab when I was the inspector general. We had some of the top forensic scientists in the world come in, and they, like everybody else, believed that the FBI lab was the gold standard in forensic science. And they discovered that the emperor had no clothes, and that in fact, much of the forensic science work that was done in the FBI lab was deeply deficient. And one of the causes of that deficiency is that the FBI lab took the position, no, we don't need to learn from anybody else. We'll teach the rest of the world how to do forensic science. And the result was that they developed terrible habits and created problems in many investigations, high-profile investigations, including the Oklahoma City bombing investigation. So you need to fight against insularity. You need to welcome outside scrutiny. You need to learn from other departments in order to be the best department you can be. So that's the report. I've gone a little longer than you planned. I know that. I apologize.
Well, thank you, Michael. I'm going to go ahead first and just I'll direct council members direct their questions to you, but I'm going to go ahead and start with them. And can you see us? I don't know if you can see us.
I can see all of you. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Madam Mayor.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you, sir. I'm sorry you couldn't be here in person, but I appreciate you on the screen. I guess first, I'm relieved to hear that the racism concerns that obviously the initial Bringleson stuff prompted, while very serious, don't appear to be epidemic or endemic to the department, as I think everybody was legitimately concerned. It sounds like your preliminary findings were that you found a racist, but not racism in the department, separate from a few incidents that you called, I forget, concerning, but sparse. So that's good. Frankly, it confirmed some of my priors and my prior beliefs. But then what I also heard was that in the course of looking into these Bringleson issues, a lot of other issues kind of reared their heads when you weren't even looking for them. And I'm thinking about, this is the first time I've learned today, the really shocking statistic that for a 10-year period, we didn't fail a single recruit. I mean, that's nuts. And it's nuts because, math says somebody poor ought to show up at some point, but it's also nuts because it sticks the community, the other officers, the city, the public with a poor officer. And the second thing that I heard was you made a reference, and I'd like you to expand on this if you have the information, to an insular attitude and what you called a club of people who took care of each other. And the reason that causes me concern is if you simultaneously have a candidate pool where everybody succeeds and then a club that takes care of people, what you can end up with is a club of bad people taking care of bad people. And that kind of dovetails in my mind with this third thing that you reported to us, which was that the internal within the department assessment of Bringleson was that he should not have been promoted under Chief Masterson in 2009, and then again in 2019 under Masterson or Bones, whoever was there at that time, and yet he was. And so I'd like, if you can, and if you have the information, for you to expand a little bit on your initial views about the insular club-like protection of people who are maybe networked like Bringleson, as you sort of suggested. But at any rate, people who are bad officers who are being taken care of from within the department, because that's concerning to me. It's concerning to the public, obviously. And I'd just like to better understand what you know both about the timeline that may have been happening, any diagnosis you have as to how that happens in departments generally based on your experience, or in ours based on what you saw here, and any specific recommendations you might have for how we tackle that, because it feels pretty nebulous and hard to get my arms around as I'm hearing this report.
Yeah, those are terrific questions. And I do want to confirm what you said at the outset, which is that we did not find vast quantities of racism in the department or any evidence there. There are a large number of racists in the department who practice racism either internally or in dealing with residents. So that is accurate. And frankly, I doubt that even an exhaustive review of the documents that we obtained would move in the other direction. So I feel comfortable reporting that to you with the limitation, obviously, that there were several episodes, credible episodes that were reported to us that we needed to do further follow-up on, but that were of sufficient concern that we took them seriously and thought they needed to be taken seriously. As to the the question about the insularity and the clubbiness, those come through most clearly in the SurveyMonkey results. And we got those very late in the game and did not have a meaningful opportunity to follow up on that and to explore that. But it is not, unfortunately, atypical of police departments or really other organizations for it to become quite clubby and there to be a cool guys group, and for there to be other groups that are sort of on the outside. And I do want to be clear that I was selective in the comments that I read from SurveyMonkey, both in 2009 and 2019. It may well have been that the majority of comments were more favorable. But what struck me, what caught my attention, was the granular detail of some of the negative comments, not just the comments about him being lazy, but the rudeness to citizens, the degrading. I mean, these people, multiple people, didn't make this stuff up. This is stuff that they experienced and they heard, and that should have been arresting to anybody considering him for promotion. And certainly with respect to when he was promoted to sergeant, we did interview a witness who is knowledgeable and involved in that process. And he thought that the reason Bringleson was promoted, he tested well, no question about that, but people turned a blind eye to the obvious warts that he had showed during his career. And they did so because they were friendly with him, because they thought he was funny, because they thought he was fun to be around, and so forth, not because they had concluded he would be a quality supervisor.
Madam Mayor, if I can follow up. Just it should be quick. I guess on the clubbiness, networky issue that you just described, in your experience, is that typically, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. What I heard was there are various problems in the department, but one of them over the last 10 to 15 years has been probably at the command staff level and not the rank and file level. In my mind, somebody who reviews a file that says lazy, 11 sustained IA investigations, let's promote this guy, is a command staff person and not like a patrol person. Is that where we should be looking?
Yeah, I think that's where you should be looking. And one of the gifts, if you will, that I think Chief Lee gave the department, and obviously he had a tumultuous tenure there, was he brought in some outsiders who are now on the command staff, who not only impressed me as knowing their business and being extremely competent, but winning the respect of people in the department, the rank and file in the department, who I think it's had a bit of a tonic effect that, okay, we may have shown some hostility to outsiders at various times, but these outsiders know what they're doing and they know what they're talking about. And we respect them as leaders. And to some extent, the same seemed to be true when Chief Lee came in. Certainly in the interviews that we conducted, I discerned a respect for Chief Lee and his background, and that he had a lot to teach. I think there were some issues relating to his leadership style and the way he interacted with other people, which antagonized various people. And I have no doubt that there was a campaign within the department to get rid of him, and they succeeded. That's not to say that he was not, to some extent, responsible for his own demise. But it's quite clear to me, in light of all the complaints that were filed seemingly in a very orchestrated way, that they wanted him gone, and they achieved their goal.
Thank you.
We're going to go with Councilmember Howie Burton, then Willits, and then the Council President.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. First of all, I appreciate the findings that you've brought forward. I especially appreciate the recommendations that you've brought forward. I think that those are extremely helpful. I do have just a little bit of confusion, and I might just be projecting, but in one statement, I'm going to kind of quote you, and if I've ruined your quote, then please correct me. You've said that the majority of people almost unanimously were very surprised by the news, the racist comments, and the different views that Bringleson put forward. But then in another statement, you talk about people's thoughts of this person as being unethical, as being singling out people judging people based off of how they look, how they talk, a variety of other things there. And I'm trying to sort of separate those two things a little bit in my head, because in my mind, if I think somebody's extremely unethical, I'm very concerned. I think that they're going to appear in the newspaper someday. And then I see them in this tweet saying these things, I would say, yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. So that's where I'm kind of wrestling with those two different sort of surveys and quotes that you presented.
Yeah. So the first part of it, that is that people were surprised to see the things that Bringleson said and that he wrote, were based on interviews that we did with people, who had served with Bringleson over time, and they thought they knew him. The comments about his ethics, the degrading remarks, and so forth, those really are based on the SurveyMonkey data that we collected for the 2 times that he was up for promotion, one in 2009 and 2019. They are correctly provided anonymously. So even if we had been permitted to continue our investigation, frankly, we wouldn't have known who to go back to. And I do want to note that even when people talk about the way he deals with people, both in the community and internally in a degrading way, they didn't say in a racist way. And obviously that's the egregious set of statements that Bringleson made, is the horrific generalizations about particularly Black people, but also Hispanic people, and painting with just a ridiculously broad brush, suggesting they're all the same, they're all bad, they all claim police brutality, they're inhuman in the way they act. I mean, just stuff that no decent person believes, much less says.
Sure. That's helpful. And I guess, so my second question here, I think it either adds on or it's being asked in a slightly different way than Councilmember Bajent. I think one of my large concerns is, how does somebody like this get promoted, continue to be promoted, when people doubt this person's leadership skills, when this person isn't well respected among other people? And so when I hear that there is some sort of good old boys club that's allowed him to move forward in these positions, I hear that there's a group of people in power who are somehow finding a way to keep somebody that they like in a position of power that has similar thoughts and ideologies to them, or maybe someone that they like. And so I see that as a system based in differences in power and potentially based in racism. So can you outline that a little bit more for me?
Yeah, I think one of the fundamental problems is that promotion within the police department, particularly above the level of sergeant, is something that not many people have wanted, because additional responsibilities, not commensurate increases in salary, and so forth. And we understand that in one case, Bringleson was approached and encouraged to seek promotion, even when he hadn't himself applied for it. So that's a real problem, and that is part of the foundation for the recommendation about leadership training and supervisory training. The department in Boise is certainly big enough, ought to be identifying and grooming people for supervisory positions, people who demonstrate leadership and who are widely admired by their peers. If they're a first level supervisor, admired by their subordinates and their superiors, and so on. It's really important. And again, I think it's a very positive step that some of the clubbiness among the command staff was broken up by Chief Lee. Some people resigned when he came in, either because they didn't want to serve under a new chief, or they didn't want to serve under him, or they found him difficult to deal with, or whatever. But the bounty that has come to the city of Boise is through having now on board a group of command staff members that I don't think could have been recruited from inside the department, because the quality of personnel who were willing to apply was not there. And so I think, you're in better shape now than you were before Chief Lee came there and brought in the outsiders. But I don't know how long those gentlemen will stay. I think it's very important to be able to confidently promote people from within. And that requires some planning for the future, some, in other contexts, is called succession training, getting people ready for the bigger jobs in the department.
And Madam Mayor, just to make sure that I have clarity there, not another question. I think what you're telling me is that there are some systems issues, but one of the issues is that there wasn't a large pool of quality candidates applying for those higher level positions. And so we may have been taking the best of what was there, even though that wasn't somebody who should have been in that position.
I think that's a very good way to put it.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Bromwich, thank you for your presentation. I'm pleased to hear that you haven't found widespread racism within the Boise Police Department, and that the good men and women of the Boise Police Department are exonerated from the horrible statements that were really ugly that Brinkelson said. You mentioned about your process, but also the cost. Obviously, you are a highly competent, highly compensated professional that has done this work in other areas. I want to make sure that I understand the boundaries in which this contract was approved. Does the city of Boise owe you any additional payments for work that has been completed at this time?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And just to clarify, it's on the agenda tonight, on the consent agenda.
But yeah, you raise an issue that's important to me, and that I see editorials and comments in your newspapers that, frankly, I think betray a lack of full understanding of what these investigations cost. So I think all of you are aware of the investigative report released by John Durham, special counsel, yesterday, after 4 years of work. That cost, even at government rates, $6.2 million. The investigation I did at the Houston Police Department Crime Lab cost $5.3 million. That was in 2005 to 2007, so I don't know what it would be inflation adjusted. The investigation I did at the Baltimore Police Department, 2 years, $5.5 million. These are expensive, and me and people like me are brought in when an institution has a very serious problem that is very concerning, and they want to get to the bottom of it. The NFL paid a law firm over $6 million to investigate Deflategate, Tom Brady's alleged use of deflated footballs. Now, I think ensuring the integrity of your police department is a hell of a lot more important than figuring out whether footballs were deflated. And so this is expensive. I was very upfront with the city about what my estimates of how much it would cost. It vastly exceeded the $500,000 figure. And frankly, I would have been happier if I was told at the outset, we can't afford that, and we would have gone our separate ways. So I do want you to be aware that these things are expensive. I charge my time out at less than half of my hourly rate. You might say, oh my God, you must charge an outrageous rate. I do. It's very high. But because you're a municipality and because I love to do this work, we charged out my time at less than 50% of what I normally charge. And we made every effort to conserve costs. We opened up a non-billable number where people on my team who wanted to get background information about the Boise Police Department, which would ordinarily in a commercial or corporate matter, we would charge to the client. We didn't charge any of that to you. I noted with interest the editorial in the Idaho Statesman today questioning whether we'd stayed at fancy hotels and ate at expensive restaurants. Nothing could be further from the truth. We stayed at a couple of mid-level hotels that were recommended by the city, and we ate at very reasonably priced restaurants. We were very careful about spending the city's money. And as for the claim that they'd like to know where every penny went, well, their own reporter has all of our billing records and knows exactly what how the costs were incurred. We bill at the 10th of an hour intervals, and our billing records show absolutely every shred of work that was done by one of our lawyers, paralegals, or other professional staff. So the idea that we were hiding the ball, or we were inflating the cost, or we were taking advantage of the city of Boise is not only wrong, it's offensive.
Council President.
Yeah, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Bromwich. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. You had mentioned a small but significant number of minority officers or BPD employees who had experienced racism internal to the department. Was it your, were you able to discover if they had reported any of that to their superiors or internal affairs, or what kind of information did you get on where those incidents led?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a mixed bag. Some of them did report it and reported back to us that nothing significant was done. Some of them said they did report it and they don't know whatever happened to it. Others said they did report it and it was not taken seriously by their immediate supervisor. Some said they didn't report it. So it's sort of, it covered sort of each of those categories. And again, there was not a huge number, but one is too many, right?
Thank you. I appreciate that answer a lot. And that gives us a little bit more to go on as we're looking into the rest of these issues. I just want to thank you for your thoroughness on a shoestring budget that we provided. I think that this is a really tremendous body of work, and I appreciate all of your efforts and the efforts of your staff. I know that it was a heavy lift, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And now, Councilmember Haney-Keith.
I'll make this quick. Thank you, Mr. Bromwich, for all of your work. I just wanted, my question was very similar to Council Member Wooding's. And, from my standpoint, the fact that you did receive at least even 6 credible potential issues or incidents. And I am concerned, even related to the issues of being insular and other things that you mentioned, that it may damper the ability of individuals to feel comfortable reporting. And so it sounds like you may not have been able to in the work that you had, but I was curious in your recommendations whether you would also recommend an evaluation of what the reporting structure, the complaint structure looks like for individuals who may experience, and the understanding of how those incidences may be resolved and how transparent they are. I was curious if you had any reflections on that.
Yeah, we really didn't have time to dip into that. I will tell you that in the other police departments in which I've done work, that is a critical issue, and many departments fail in that aspect of the process, the accountability process. Do people feel like they're really encouraged to report misconduct? If they report misconduct, do they risk retaliation? If they report misconduct, are those allegations treated seriously? And if they're substantiated, is serious discipline imposed? And is it imposed within a reasonable period of time? Those are sort of the critical elements to have an accountability system within a police department, where members of that department say, yeah, if somebody treats me badly, if somebody is racist towards me or discriminates against me because of my gender or my ethnicity, if I report it, it will be taken seriously. It's critically important, and it's an issue in every department I've ever worked in.
Thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Bromwich, it looks as if there are no further questions from council. I want to say too, thank you. I deeply appreciate the work that you did, the conversations you had, and both the offering of provisional findings in this report, but also the recommendations you provided with us today, for us today. And I got to say too, that I'm relieved and really grateful that you couldn't point to clear evidence of widespread racism and white supremacy. But I also heard you reference and know that it's very important that this look into the department was key to ensure that our officers do indeed, and we learned today for the most part, haven't experienced racism, but it's important to me to know that they feel safe and they feel respected in the workplace and have opportunities to be promoted. And it's important that our residents feel and continue to feel the trust with the police department that they always have. And so with your findings today, you've both, relieved us and cleared the names. Our officers, the department in general, deserve to have their name cleared after we've all experienced the shocking news, but gave us a lot to think about with regard to the robust set of recommendations that you provided. And so for council, I'd say, I believe great questions asked today, but our staff, chief, others need time to digest, as do we, the recommendations. And so I think our best steps, knowing, I'd say, I should say it's not a given, but that I'm confident with the resources that we have, with the leadership team that we have, with the look that the council has done on oversight and accountability, that we can handle and address these recommendations with existing resources and the teams in place. Because it's important to everybody. It's important to me. Chief is nodding. I know it's important to him that we address these recommendations and really, frankly, follow the motto that we have, that there's nothing we can't do better. So I'm going to ask that staff take these, return to us. I'm not going to set a date because you need some time to really look through them. I know council will have some reactions and probably additional questions or interest in having conversation with the chief and staff. But I propose that staff take these, review the recommendations more fully, come back to us with information on the ability to address them, ways that they might be addressed, or recommendations to address them if they believe they can't be addressed in-house. And then we'd further that conversation at that point in time. And no action needs to be taken, but I just want to get a sense of, from council, if that's the best path forward at this point.
Madam Mayor, I think that's a wise path forward. And I would anticipate that as we're moving forward through that process, council members might also have some ideas on how we address some of these through policy, and would welcome those to be brought to our attention.
Madam Mayor, I might just have a couple more
Yeah.
things. One, again, I just want to relay the appreciation for the work that your team has done, Mr. Bromwich, for the investigation. I realize that in many ways you feel like it's not complete, and in some other ways that you feel comfortable with making recommendations, which I think is really appreciated by everyone here. I also appreciate the officers that were involved and who decided that they would participate in the interviews, giving candid responses, because I think that we, as individuals, as organizations, as departments, we should want to know where our flaws are and where our systems are failing, because that's the only way that we can improve. And when we have biases that are exposed that maybe we're aware of or unaware of, that's when we have the opportunity to actually address them. And I would say I welcome the further discussion. I have particular interest in making sure that we talk about how people get promoted within the department into these leadership positions, how we make sure that they have the ability to lead their officers and have that skill set. And that's not necessarily passing a test with flying colors. It's really being able to work with the other people and to lead an organization. And I have some serious concerns about the way that Bringleson managed to move up through that process. And that's going to be an area that I'm really going to want to see us address going forward.
All right. Well, with that, Mr. Bromwich, thank you. Appreciate it. And we are going to recess until our meeting at 6 o'clock. So good evening.
You're welcome. Thank you. Good luck to all of you. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Everybody, we'll be back at 6.